Hey everybody, it's Matt Nelson, and I'm here with Jared Zimmerer, and today is the first ever Evangelization Culture Show. So, before we get started, we're going to talk about Affirmative Orthodoxy today, but first I want to ask Jared what you've been up to lately.
Oh, lots, man. Actually, just this past weekend, I took my kids. I have 6 kids, and took them to go see The Addams Family. And my fifth kid, Leo, right? The kid is just a mess, man. And he used to be really into creepy stuff. Like one time, we were at a grocery store, and he was wearing a hoodie, and he put the hood over his head and went up to some stranger going, "I'm a go." So he used to be really into that, and then he got kind of like scared of things. And so we went to the Addams Family thinking we'll see what happens. And he loved it, and now he's back at the house, like trying to scare people again and trying to pretend he's a ghost. But it's a good movie. It's actually a decent little film. I mean, it's a continuation, obviously, of the story, but it's a good movie. But other than that, man, just things rock and rolling here at the Institute, man. It's amazing to finally do our first episode of the show.
I know. We've been talking about doing this for a long time, and finally we're able to do this, and it's exciting because we've already started recording our interviews with some of our guests for those that are watching this right now or listening to this, future guests. We've already sat down with
Arthur Brooks.
Yeah, I've sat down with Arthur Brooks, who is
also coming up for a new Bishop Barron Presents in November, later this month. And so he was the former president of the American Enterprise Institute. He's now a professor at Harvard. And he is, I think, one of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? The most well-written, the most well-spoken individual I know on how to present Catholic social teaching in the modern world, because he understands both the economic issues that are much more kind of mathematical, et cetera, and how they these different styles of economics express themselves in society, but then he's also a devout Catholic, and so the way he sees morality underpinning the whole thing, and the way he sees the necessity of the human dignity, all of that. So it's a phenomenal interview.
Yeah, and actually, I was not familiar with Dr. Brooks's content until we started to prepare for that episode. And on Netflix, he's got a documentary that is based off of him and his life and the work that he's doing. And I had no idea that he's the big deal that he is, doing the great things he's doing. So that'll be a great episode. We've had Sal DiStefano sit down with us from Mind Pump. Some of you are probably familiar with the Mind Pump podcast just because it's one of the most popular fitness podcasts out there today. So if you go on iTunes, I think it's like often rated like one of the top 3 health and wellness or fitness podcasts out there. Bishop Barron sat down with the Mind Pump team last year, did an interview, and just sat down and did a second one with them. But yes, we had Sal. Sal is not a believer. He's journeying towards what looks like potentially belief, and so we talked to him about that journey that he's been along, and so that's going to be a great interview.
Yeah, and also the realities of the fitness culture. Some of the goods, some of the bad of what's going on in the fitness culture, and so if anybody knows that stuff, it's Sal. It was a great conversation with him. But
that was a fun interview because it was a real mix of culture, but also spiritual topics as well. So there'll be more of that kind of an interview for people to look forward to as well. We have Ryan Mickler of the Order of Man podcast, who we haven't sat down to interview yet, but that'll be coming up real soon. It's going to be. He's got a huge following on the internet, and he's doing a lot of great stuff in the man podcast world.
And we also have Haley Stewart coming up, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners probably know who that is. And I think that the way that she understands literature and family life is just one of the best out there today. And I think that what we're hoping to do with this show, particularly with whenever we do interviews, this show is just going to be just you and I. But whenever we do interviews, we really do want to discuss the culture with people who are cultural influencers. So it's not always going to be about evangelization. It's not always going to be about, specifically Catholic things. Sometimes it's just going to be about culture, some of the good, some of the bad. So talking about movies and films, but also family life, fitness industry, economics. I mean, it's a pretty wide-ranging topic-based, but I think that what we're trying to do with this show is provide a means by which we can talk to the ad extra world, to go out, which is one of obviously Bishop Barron's guiding principles, is to go out. I mean, that's why he did the Mind Pump podcast. That's why he went on to Dave Rubin's show, to go out into the culture. So, but for today's culture, or for today's show, I thought that what I would really like to talk about, because when we're talking about the culture and we're talking about the good and the bad of it, something that consistently has become, even on a purely sociological level, is a growth in what actually Arthur Brooks calls the culture of contempt. And I think that, unfortunately, some of that has spilled into the Catholic culture. You see it especially on social media. And I don't know if it's an aspect of social media being kind of a disembodied reality that causes this kind of stuff. But, we're consistently seeing a culture in which it's easier to attack than affirm. And I think that that's a major problem, especially if we're talking about evangelization and going out to the world. If they're looking into Catholic culture and it does not look healthy, it's not a very attractive reality to want to join. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that one of the things we're trying to do in the Word on Fire Institute is try to bring people into a conversation, talk about what's really working today and what's not. We all know it. It's one big family. The Catholic Church is, over 1 billion strong. I think are we 2 billion, I think, today or something like that. There's going to be infighting. I mean, take a little family. There's going to be times of tension. Right. And so people know that. And a lot of times it's whether it's the fighting within the church or else the scrapping that goes on between one given religion or one given denomination of religion and those outside. That always makes the news and that always gets the attention on social media or whatever. But that's not the way that we're trying to do things. And that's not the way that Christian missionaries and evangelists have been successful in the past. One of the great exemplifiers of getting beyond this culture of contempt and really being an example of what Bishop Barron calls affirmative orthodoxy is G.K. Chesterton. We're both huge fans of Chesterton, but how has Chesterton influenced you in your approach to evangelization?
Well, I always think about the fact that, if you read Chesterton, he's one of the most kind of quippy, punchy guys that you'll read. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, I remember one professor that I was speaking about Chesterton with, he said he will rip you apart and you won't even know it because he's so good at kind of affirming you in who you are as an individual, but then at the same time providing such a fantastic argument to undermine a problematic belief. And I always think about his relationship with, I would say Wells, but it wasn't Wells, it was G.B. Shaw, what's his first name? George Bernard Shaw.
Yeah.
How they would debate each other and very lively debate where it was, getting very serious, but then right after they'd go have a beer together. Mm-hmm. He loved him, And so it was one of those things of not only just the prowess of his writing style, of how he could present an argument and how quippy he was and the way he could handle people, but at the same time, he was a devout Christian. He loved no matter who it was. And so if we're talking about affirmative orthodoxy, he could be one of the patron saints of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you talk about this idea of Chesterton ripping you apart without you even realizing it. Probably what better understood as ripping the argument apart, right. Which is, St. Paul used that kind of language in the scriptures when he says we destroy arguments. And so that's something that Chesterton was really good at doing, but he was so amiable while he did it that he was seeking out at the same time to correct his brother, but also to be a brother to the person he was correcting. And I know for me, one of the most influential books that I've ever read since I came back to the Catholic Church when I was 25 years old was Orthodoxy. Yeah. In fact, it's probably my favorite book out of all the Catholic literature that I have access to. And one of the reasons I say that is because I can't think of another book outside of the scriptures themselves that has changed me more just by reading it. And I go back to Orthodoxy all the time. And the thing about Chesterton is the more you discover, and the more your palate starts to seek more G.K. Chesterton, the more you seek more works of of his, and the problem is he's got endless works for you, whether you want poetry or journalism or fiction or good history, theology. Yeah. He wrote it all. You can't get there.
And I think too that when Arthur Brooks uses the term contempt, he said there's a difference between wanting to correct a person's idea or belief because you love the individual versus thinking that this individual isn't even worth my time. Mm-hmm. He compares it to, say, in a marriage, right, where sometimes the fighting might actually be kind of a healthy thing because you're both expressing yourself, you both want the best for each other, that sometimes that's going to turn into a little bit of a match. But he said that a lot of marriage counselors will say that once they reach the point of contempt, which is where it's much more just kind of eye-rolling, not even giving them the time of day to express themselves, that is what the culture is drifting towards, that we think of the other individual as not even worth my time. Mm-hmm. And that's majorly problematic if we're talking about evangelization, especially when we're talking about sharing the Gospels, right? And so when we're talking about a culture of contempt, it's less about this idea of niceness, right? Because, just like Chesterton, he will understand your ideas and potentially rip those ideas to shreds, but he's not tying the idea to the individual. He's able to do that. And I think, unfortunately, we tend to tie the two together. And so you end up attacking the person most often. But there's also another aspect of affirmative orthodoxy, which is just the character of the individual, that you express yourself consistently in a loving and affirmative way, that you're always speaking to the person in love. So even if you're presenting an argument that the other person absolutely disagrees with, rather than getting angry and hitting the table, it's an ability to even smile while you're disagreeing. Those small little mannerisms that can make for good dialogue. It makes for good evangelization.
So would you say that affirmative orthodoxy then, let's say, has at least two components to it? One component would be affirming the person, and then the second part would be affirming Catholic doctrine, but in an affirmative way. So, for example, if we're talking about like a hot topic like contraception, you could talk about like thou shalt not contracept, or you could talk about thou shalt have or appreciation for life. Yeah. Presenting beliefs like Catholic beliefs about not using contraception. We don't believe that because we believe that the marital act should be completely open to life. Presenting that belief of ours as Catholics as a pro-life view versus an anti-contraception view you're talking about the same thing, but you're delivering it in positive wrapping, as it were. Mm-hmm. It doesn't come across as a finger-waving delivery, but rather affirming delivery.
Right. Yeah. And it's not undermining the actual doctrine either, or undermining the belief. It's not taking away the strength of the argument. Right. I think it actually allows for a broadening of the mind of the person you're talking to, because if you come at them as it was me versus you versus us together aiming for truth, right? Kind of the Socratic model of we're trying to figure out what's right here together. As Catholics, we have the blessing of being able to go to magisterial sources and et cetera to know what the truth is. But in individual conversations and even on social media, Arthur Brooks uses, I believe his name is Dr. Gottfried, I'm forgetting his last name right now, but he talks about affirm the individual 5 times before you finally disagree with them, which I think is actually a pretty good strategy. If you're going into it as a debate, obviously it's a different kind of style of things, but typically interpersonal relationships is not a debate, and it really shouldn't be.
Yeah, I feel like it's more the substance of what he's saying than actually taking that as a technique. Like if you and I are disagreeing and I affirm you 5 times before I disagree with you, you're going to think that's weird. Right. So it's like, but I think the idea there is probably what he's getting at, and I think what's valuable is, and this is what the best apologists in Christianity do today. Trent Horne is an example, somebody I think of, who's really good at affirming something that the person he's speaking to has said before he says, but here's where I disagree. Mm-hmm. Someone else that's good at that is Stephanie Gray. She's a Canadian pro-life apologist, and she does that when she speaks to people who are pro-choice. She always starts with an affirmation saying, yeah, this thing you've said is true. So yes, I agree with you, but here's where I don't agree with you.
Yeah.
And so I think that's proven itself to be a really, I mean, Thomas Aquinas had a way of doing that in his Summa Theologica when he looked at what non-Catholics or even non-Christians, pagans like Aristotle, had to say about the world, and then he took what was true and began often by even giving credit to, he called Aristotle the philosopher in the Summa, but he was giving credence to what has been said that's true, even by those who otherwise would disagree with him.
Yeah, but I think it's also, just thinking of Aquinas as an example, he would provide their arguments in the best way. So give the questions that his interlocutors might ask, and then answer those questions. So it's kind of one of those things, if you truly want to evangelize or provide the truth to an individual, you need to know how they're operating. What is the argument that they're operating on, and what are some of the maybe nuances that might be going into how they understand these kinds of things, such as experience, et cetera.
That's like that's like the technique that Bishop Barron talks about that he derived from the psychologist Carl Rogers, where he says, like, it's always good to say, so what you're saying is, so that you repeat back to the person what you hear them saying, so that they can then affirm that, that is what I'm saying, so that you're actually addressing what's actually being said and that you're not speaking over each other.
Exactly. Yeah. And by doing that, they can either affirm or deny that, no, that's not what I'm saying, right? So if you're trying to provide an argument and I'm not even on the same grounding and I'm operating on this way and you're going this way, it doesn't make for good dialogue. It doesn't make for good debate or discussion. So, one of the recent kind of cultural realities that I've kind of picked up on, this potential for proselytism. Right now on Netflix, there's a show called The Last Kingdom, and it's another show about the Vikings taking over England, specifically the Danes. It's your people coming over, and this is in the mid 800s. It's during the time of Alfred the Great. And I actually listened to a show. It's actually based on a book by Bernard Cornwall, and he's actually saying that the way he creates historical fiction is you kind of have the big narrative, which is always historically true, which is the fact that the Danes came to England and slowly took over until they got down to Wessex, and then there's the smaller narrative, which is much more fictional. And so if you're watching the show, a lot of the characters and the movements and the relationships and all of that may not be totally historically accurate, but a lot of the show actually is. But there's some really interesting dialogue and perspective on how to share the gospel and how not to share the gospel, especially when you're dealing with a culture that's very different from your own. And so in that show, there's several times when, and I get it, I mean, these guys are coming. The Vikings are not there in a peaceful way. They're there to kill and take over, right? But you have Christian believers thinking of these individuals as if they're not humans, right? As if they don't have human dignity. There's even one point in there where one of the religious brothers says they don't even have souls, right? And so it takes it to a point where it turns into proselytism, where we'll only work with you if you convert. We'll only work with you if you become baptized, and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, wow, what an interesting kind of opposite to understand how to evangelize. That's not the way we operate. Right.
One of the things about that series that really jumps out to me, and let me say before I finish that thought, that you just got me onto this series like last week and said, hey, we should talk about this next week when we do the Evangelization Culture Show. So get in there. And I watched the first 3 episodes, and I, like you predicted, I'm hooked. One of the things that, and by the way, the Danes technically, this is interesting actually what I'm about to say, because it ties into what I was going to say before. Technically, the Danes aren't my people, because now I guess I would be Canadian, but I'm of Danish descent. My great-grandfather immigrated from Denmark and Denmark, as they say in Eastern Canada, and he established a homestead in Saskatchewan in Western Canada. My family still farms there today. So it was interesting, though, to watch this series, which is a historical, it's based off of real historical events. It's not strictly historical, I don't think, but But being, a few generations away from immigrants from Denmark, it was interesting to watch. What really stood out to me in those first 3 episodes, this is what I've been trying to spit out for the last minute here, is the tension of identities. Because, and I don't think this is going to be too much of a spoiler alert, so I think you'll be fine even if you haven't started this series and you hear this. But what you've got is an English or like a Saxon child who then is taken into custody, Uhtred, who's taken into custody by Danes and then is raised by the Danes, but then finds himself now trying to reclaim his position within the Saxon community, his birthright. So you can see, at least in the first 3 episodes that I've seen, this real tension between Uhtred and then talking to others, and in the dialogues he has with others, whether they be Dane or Saxon, is he's trying to figure out, am I Dane or am I Saxon? Right. And yet there's a third option that kind of plays through this too, and that's if you're a Christian, then where does that come through? Is that more foundational than being Danish or Saxon? Or like, how does that all work? So I like how the series is playing around with this idea of identity and like how you're born or where you're born or who your parents are or whether you've been baptized or not. Like, what does all that mean in the end for who you are as a human person?
Yeah. When it was interesting too, using in the show, you see sort of a... what would you call it? Maybe like a battling of the gods, because the Vikings are obviously operating on a Norse mythology and a Norse religion, and they firmly see it as we are here to fulfill our duty to Odin. We're here to do what it means to be a Viking in order to get to Valhalla. But then you have the Christians doing similar things where it's like, no, we're going into this battle with God behind us, right? It reminded me of the Old Testament where you have kind of, the Jews going in with the Ark of the Covenant and understanding that if God's here, we'll win, right? But it was interesting how between those two cultures, there was also still so much similarity on basic human level, that they still believed in family, they still believed in loyalty to your tribe, they still believed in the basic understanding of what it means to be a human. And so when we're talking about affirmative orthodoxy, I mean, granted, again, these guys were unbelievably violent, and so sometimes violence causes violence, and it's just a reality that if you're trying to save your culture, you might have to. But there's another way, and I tend to think of when Bishop Barron had a interview with Ben Shapiro, and Ben Shapiro brought up the faith and works dichotomy, and he said, well, actually Christianity is the way of love, right? So it's a third way. So it seems like the show is operating on these kind of only 2 ways, that this side's proselytizing and conquering, or this side's proselytizing and conquering. But the true Christian is a third way, that it's the way of love. And if you understand martyrdom as the seed of the church, right, that love tends to, especially if you're going into a violent culture, you're going to find plenty of martyrs most of the time. But it was an interesting kind of these 2 worldviews based on religion, which today, because we've become so secularized, it may be a different kind of reality. But these 2 worldviews based on religion, we're trying to figure out what does it mean to live together. And it was a constant just violence back and forth. And it operated in that they're not like us, it's us versus them on both sides. And so because of that, you constantly had this violent reaction to the other. Whereas in an idea of affirmative orthodoxy, affirming the human individual, finding the little logoi spermatikoi, the seeds of the word in their culture, right? So you see Tolkien seeing, even in Norse mythology, these beautiful ways in which God was revealing himself to the Norse people. And so instead of violently reacting to the other, let's find out where is a common ground here and operate on that.
Yeah. Well, and I like what you brought up about love being this third way, going back to what Bishop Barron said to Shapiro in that interview. I think that that's an important point to make, because what Bishop Barron is speaking about there is almost a primacy rather than an either or. He's not saying faith and works don't have a place in the faith. Of course they do. But it's not strictly even, I think, if I understand Bishop Barron properly and if I understand my faith properly, it's not strictly an either faith or works, and it's not strictly faith and works, but rather it's a faith and works, but infused with love. So it is a third way in that sense. And St. Paul talks about that in his letter to Galatians when he talks about circumcision being of no avail, but faith working through love. Faith and love cannot be separated. When they do, it's no longer Christian faith. And so I think that's what Bishop Barron was getting at, is this idea of love being something that has to permeate everything we do. And so, again, going back to now the Last Kingdom, you see this tension, because I think as human beings, we're made in the image and likeness of God. And St. Paul says in Romans that even for those that haven't heard the law, there's still no excuse, because they've got the law written on their hearts. So in the Last Kingdom, you see these pagan people who have not yet heard the gospel, who are, so far from being civilized, so far from being well educated, and yet they're still grappling with this idea of human dignity. You see, as you watch things play out in their culture, you see the barbariousness of the barbarians, right? They, you look at a barbarian wrong, they'll kill you.
Right.
And yet at the same time, you see this underlying sense of the human dignity when, say, their children are persecuted. And you see, I'm not going to give it away, but there's a couple times in those first few episodes where a child of a Dane is in some way offended, and so then the father takes revenge. But the father suddenly sees morality as something objective, and the dignity of their child being an objective reality. And so there's this sense of human dignity, and yet it's like they forget it the next moment, and they go and kill someone for no good reason.
And there's successive scenes of this one of the leaders that ends up coming into power within the Danish community, where he's consistently staying. They take over this castle, and throughout several episodes, you mostly see him in the chapel. And you see him in there staring at the crucifix. You see him in there staring at many of the icons that they have there. And he brings in a priest at a certain point to talk to him about it, but you can tell he's mocking it, yet genuinely interested. And you see even a point where he ends up turning over the tables and gets upset because the Christian God just beat them in some way. And so you see this kind of interior wrestling with what is true. And so even though the culture is so much different, the religion was so much different, there's still the basic desire for to know, right? I mean, that's what Aristotle, Aquinas, all these people would say, is that man desires to know. And so even at a basic human level, and so as Christians, it would be best to operate, especially in the modern world, where it's maybe secularism is the new God, the lowercase g God, to find points of access where what are they wrestling with, right? Bishop Barron constantly brings up, the Augustine's restless heart. What is that restless heart trying to find, and where are ways in which I might be able to speak to that restless heart, where it's not coming in and saying, you're wrong, I'm right. And there's a small aspect to that, but not in a competitive sense. It's more of, I have found treasure, and I want you to come with me to find it. And so in order to do that, though, we've got to find certain areas where we agree, or else it's just going to turn into violent reactions, either in verbal form or otherwise, like in the Danes. But it's a fascinating show. It's a really interesting show, but also just the storytelling and the narrative and the production, and it's just really, really
And as with any Netflix series, like there's a little bit of colorful content, but compared to most of what's
Game
out
of
there,
Thrones or something like that.
You just got to be ready to turn your eyes, for a split second here and there. But it's, for the most part, though, they've kept it decently clean, and so discernfully take in the series. And I think that there's people who watch it will have much to gain. I was going to recommend as well this book here by Christopher Dawson, a great historian. Jared's doing some work in his graduate work right now. With Dawson, you're writing a paper on him or something?
Yeah, that'll be next semester. I'm going to go do a full dive into about 7 of his books.
Yeah. So is this going to be one of them?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is Religion and the Rise of Western Culture. I haven't read this. It's been a few years since I read this, but when I was watching The Last Kingdom, it brought this to life, because in this, Dawson, one of the great Catholic historians of the 20th century, talks about how the barbarians played a key role in especially the early medieval period in this transfer of the gospel, because initially they were the hearers of the gospel. But what's interesting is not only did the Christians start to help the barbarian cultures evolve and become better people, but also there was an influence of the barbarian peoples on the Christians. And so it's kind of a give and take, and it's not a clean give and take. There's the good and the bad being passed in either direction by both sides, but the complexity and the interplay between these different cultures during this sort of primitive task of evangelization from the early Christians, it does shed some light then on the complexity of even evangelizing our contemporary culture. So definitely read this book by Christopher Dawson, and I'd say any book you can get by Dawson.
Yeah, he's really interesting too, because he makes the case, and I think he's right, that culture comes from religion. So you can't have a true cultus, right? A gathering of people who believe in the same thing and worship the same thing without religion. Yeah. And so I think what he's doing is actually undermining this idea of a secular world, that you can't truly do that. Like you're worshiping something. It just may not be an actual divine being. It may be material, right? So there's a religion involved in some way. And so I think that in order to see culture through a Catholic lens, Dawson, just gives a phenomenal perspective on how to read culture in the way that we see our own faith. And so even like watching The Last Kingdom, being able to see that without turning into, I'm a Christian, therefore I just want the other guys to lose. Instead, to be able to watch it holistically and to see it not only as a good piece of art, as an art form, but then also to kind of critique it in a way that you see maybe it's critiquing modern culture slightly, and so it gives us a good lens. That's why Bishop Barron is so good at what he does, because he's able to see culture as a movement of religion, of providence, of humanity, all this interplay going on together. But
and as like Blaise Pascal is famous for saying, man is both a combination of wretchedness and greatness. So that sheds light then on the complexity of evangelization, because if I'm evangelizing you, or if I'm just getting to know you as a friend, you and I both know that we're both complex individuals that are far from perfect. And so anytime you're trying to take the gospel to somebody to proclaim Christ to them, you're going to be meeting, it doesn't matter who it is, there's going to be the good, the bad, and the ugly that you're going to encounter there. And so, we're all a blend of wretchedness, sadness, anger, brokenness, but also greatness, because we hold within ourselves the image of God and the dignity, a godlike dignity that we've been bestowed with by God. And so the human person is a complexity, and we can never forget that when we evangelize. Watching now today and what's in theaters, you're going to be beholding, for the most part, a complexity. It's going to be the good, the bad, and the ugly. And yes, we need to have some standards when we're choosing what we're going to watch, whether it's on Netflix or in the theaters. But ultimately, it's a good exercise in getting through the weeds, recognizing what the weeds are, pulling them or getting past them, and finding what's really of worth there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thinker that comes to mind as well is John Henry Newman, which for all of our listeners, we're right in the midst of Bishop Barron's course on John Henry Newman. It's a 12-part course. If you really want to dive into this incredible man, who better than Bishop Barron to do it for you? But it made me think of his idea of the elation, of the illative sense, that whenever we come to a belief, it's often a combination of numerous things. So you have kind of the notional side of it, which is much more arguments and trying to understand the kind of a priori reality. But then you also have experiences, and you have, which would be, what he calls, the realisant aspect of it, that you bring all of that in. So the way you were raised as a child, the country you were raised in, the state you were raised in, the religion you were raised in, all of that stuff plays a role in how you come to assent to a reality. And so even Russell Kirk said that he became Catholic because of elation. It wasn't the one thing that brought him over. It was a combination of numerous things, relationships, friendships, etc. And so whenever we think of the individual, we never think in terms of, as long as I get that one thing thing right with them, they'll desire to convert. That's not how it works. It's, as you said, we're so complex, that we bring all of these things in, and it's really, truly impossible to totally detach yourself from some of those things like experiences, as much as we prefer that we could, stay in the realm of ideas and stay in that realm because it's much more logical and, analytical. But it's a reality that the human person brings in his head, his heart, and his gut all the way into assenting to a truth.
I had a recently I had a well-sustained conversation with Bishop Barron about the new apologetics. So that's something that he's been talking about for a while, and I think it's something he's developing. Like, what does that mean exactly? And so I've been bugging him a little bit, as you know, at the staff retreat a couple months ago. I was asking him questions about it, and then when I was with him in Oxford a few weeks ago, over supper, him and I had a chance to talk more about this. And I was saying, like, what does this look like? And so we were kind of hashing out what the new apologetics might look like. And one of the things that he talked about was how we need to get back, first of all, to thinkers like Newman, Pascal, Augustine. These are men who are not opposed to the notional. They weren't opposed to rational arguments, and yet they saw the importance of this sort of pre-rational way of bringing someone to assent. So they were apologists of the heart just as much as they were apologists of the mind. Because a lot of times you can propose a syllogism, you can propose St. Thomas's 5 ways, or the Kalam cosmological argument, which is really popular today, or the moral argument for God's existence. Those are all good arguments. I'm a big fan of them. It's what I like to talk about. But at the end of the day, if we want to evangelize people, if we actually want to get off the high horse of notional arguments and actually move somebody in a new direction towards the Lord, then we have to be able to move their heart first, so that hearing the then intellectual arguments, they're actually going to make a change in their life. Otherwise, it's just empty words and syllogisms. So Newman, Pascal, Augustine, these are all people that we would do well to go back, return to, and even figures like Saint Therese of Lisieux. Yeah. These are people we need to read and consider how what they have to say can help us be better evangelists of the culture.
Yeah. Well, dude, this has been a great show, man. This is our
first one.
Our first one.
It'll be our first one, our worst one, our most awkward one when we look back. But we got it off the ground.
Exactly. But well, I hope all of our listeners got something out of today's episode. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes as well as on YouTube to stay up to date with all of the episodes that we'll be releasing. As we mentioned at the beginning, we've got a lot of big stuff coming up. And if you're interested in the Word on Fire Institute, be sure to go to wordonfire.institute. And when you join the Institute, you will actually be able to take that course that we've talked about with Newman, numerous other courses as well. You'll also be able to get a copy of this beautiful journal that will be coming out quarterly throughout the year. And so, Matt, any kind of final thoughts?
Got nothing.
You can say something Canadian if you'd like, but all right. Well, as a true Texan, I'll say, well, y'all have a good day, and tune in next time.
See you next time, eh?